Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we convene our third of 5 sessions on strategies of resistance in a time of Trump. Today, I want to open our session by offering a very concise reflections on the fragility of democracy, not only in our time, but historically, since the rise of the great imperial civilizations about 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. Because I think if we hold this context, we'll better understand the challenges of bringing democracy to empire. The first point that is important to note that the prevailing worldview that democracy started in Athens is completely false. The Iroquois people, for example, had been practicing democracy for several thousand years in North America before Athens was even the gleam in the eye of Theseus. By legend, founded in the 7th and 8th century BC. Indigenous people and peoples around the world have been practicing democracy for a significantly long time. What happened was that democracy was essentially lost with the rise of the great city-states in China, in India, in Mesopotamia, in Mesoamerica, Latin America, 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. Because with the rise of the city-states, slavery, war, political elites, coercive state power became the requisites for civilization and imperial hegemony. And democracy had to fight its way into that matrix. And as we've seen from the history of the several thousand years, it hasn't been easy. It appeared in Athens for sure in the 5th century BC, coinciding with the golden age of Periclean Athens. But it was done in a very exclusive way, limited to only certain males, not women, not slaves, not foreigners. And it only lasted for a brief few decades during the 5th century before succumbing to the tyranny that took over Athens as a result of the Peloponnesian War. Then it effectively died out. It began to come into formation in Europe in 1215 with the signing of the Magna Carta, where the robber barons of the time said to King John that he had to share absolute power with them. But there was no question about democracy, but it was the first chink in the armor of absolute monarchy. And that was due to a significant degree because of the Celtic and the Anglo-Saxon Germanic democratization impulse of those tribes in deep antiquity. The Germanic tribes, Northern European tribes, which were then brought into the European civilization, had a tradition of democracy. I want to fast forward to the United States because I want to frame the discussion we're going to have today in the following way. There was no democracy in England at the time of the Revolutionary War. That didn't happen until the next century. But what had happened in Europe and what was happening in what was to become the United States was the indigenous peoples that had been conquered by the Europeans turned out to be their intellectual and moral superiors. And if you know your history, you know that it was the Native Americans that generated the first discussions in Europe about human rights, about egalitarianism, about the equality of women, and about democracy and the right of every sovereign individual to leave where he or she was if she didn't like the way that they were ruling. That worldview had effect. And so when the United States went through its constitutional process, it incubated those aspects of an indigenous tradition because the indigenous traditions were alive all around them. And the Iroquois in particular, one of the oldest democracies in the world, had an influence on the Constitutional Convention of the United States in 1783. And what came out was the first democratic impulse in modernity. All men, white men, over the age of 25 that own property were given the right to vote. Not women, not slaves, not foreigners, just white males over the age of 25. Because the United States at that time officially was a slave state, what they call a settler colonial state. And then came the Civil War. And Abraham Lincoln's impulse expressed so profoundly in the Emancipation Declaration of 1863 that all men, not women, but all men are created equal. And that led to the 15th, 16th, 17th amendments of the US Constitution, which liberated the Black people and initially gave Black men the franchise, but that was quickly snuffed out as under Reconstruction, the United States went from a slave state to an apartheid state of severe segregation, in which, for all practical purposes, Black men had no vote. And then the women started the process, not only in the United States, but also in Europe, simultaneously. And finally, in 1918, women were given the right to vote, but not all women and not all men. And the process of democratization took that next step. And then an extraordinary thing happened in the aftermath of the Civil Rights Act of 1965 that finally gave the vote to Black people. That's only 60 years ago. And that came coterminous with the women's liberation movement, that voting is one thing, but the liberation in the workplace, in the home, in the world, as women were experiencing one glass ceiling after another that had to be broken. And then for the first time within the civilizational matrix, the question of gender and sexuality began to rise, demanding equality in every aspect. And when that happened, you hit the core of what most urgently needs to be repressed if you're going to build the kinds of civilizations that have created the United States. And it was Freud that said in his great work, Civilizations and Its Discontents, that the key is the repression of sexual instincts. Because if you can repress sexual instincts, he said, and aggressive instincts, but fundamentally sexual instincts, you can control everything else. So, book worth reading, Civilizations and Civilization and Its Discontents by Sigmund Freud. So what we've been witnessing over the last 20, 30, 40 years as the gays and the lesbians and the, all the gender fluidity identifications begin to surface is alarm. And now what we're experiencing is the empire is striking back. Because they understand, not consciously, but certainly unconsciously, that when you liberate sexuality and gender, it strikes to the heart of the coercive power that maintains an imperial state, which the United States is. So while we're discussing various issues, we also need to hold that the liberation that we're struggling for in this moment at the level of gender, which we'll be discussing, is actually a portal to the much greater revolutionary activity of our time as to whether humanity writ large is mature enough and courageous enough to rework state power to support human freedom and equality rather than repress it. That's the central question of strategies of resistance in our time. So thank you, everyone, for joining us here on Humanity Rising. It's always a delight to be with you, grappling with these deep issues in the spirit of truth pursued, not truth possessed. I want to now turn it over to my good friend and colleague, Tom Eddington, who is the convener of this whole program this week. Tom, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. As always, thank you for your deep insight and profound thoughts as we venture into each of these days' programs. Before we get into today's program, though, I want to build off of what Jim just shared. We were hearing signals from candidate Trump about what he was going to do if he were elected. And we identified in our preparation for this week 4 targets that he had identified. And so on Tuesday, we focused on the immigrant population here in the U.S. Today, we're focused on the gender issue that he has identified. Tomorrow, we will be will be focused on women's sovereignty, and Friday will be focused on the environment. And those were the four populations that now President Trump was very clear he was going to be going after. And what I hadn't anticipated was that there was another concern. And on Tuesday, President Trump met in the Oval Office with the SoftBank CEO, Masayoshi Son, OpenAI's Sam Altman, and Oracle Corp's Larry Ellison to unveil an initial $100 billion investment into AI infrastructure, which is expected to scale to $500 billion over the next 4 years. And one of the executive orders that President Trump did on Tuesday was to rescind, or on Monday rather, rescind former President Joe Biden's sweeping executive order on AI, immediately halting the implementation of key safety and transparency requirements for AI developers. So not only has President Trump identified 4 target audiences specifically that he has viewed as a threat to America, but he has now put humanity at risk. He has unleashed AI onto the world. He's made a commitment that the US is going to dominate AI, and he's allowing industry to take this on with no guardrails, no controls, no means of controlling whatsoever. And I had not anticipated him going after humanity itself. And I was concerned with the possibility of what he could do. And there's a new threat that goes beyond all that he's done. So focusing on today's dialogue, back in 1776, Thomas Paine wrote, "These are the times that try men's souls." And I would say in 2025, these are times that try all of our souls. John Lewis was famously quoted as talking about helping heal America's soul. And I think that's the challenge for all of us. As I've shared throughout the week, there were 90 million Americans who didn't vote in the most recent election, and 75 million Americans who voted for candidate Harris. And somehow, some way, we need to find a way to unite to deal with the challenges that we're being faced with. And Jonathan Last, writing for The Bulwark, talked about within the Republican Party and President Trump, vice is a moat. In the Trumpified world of Republican politics, vice has become a moat. If a figure is a bad enough person, it inspires fanatical loyalty in Republican voters and helps protect them from challenges. Since then, vice signaling has grown from a peculiar social pathology linked to Donald Trump to a broader mode of ethics in which Republican voters embrace personal vice in their champions. Republicans embrace vice not because they believe that the accused Republican figures are innocent, but because they believe they are guilty. And so those voters exist in the hope that their champion will go on to hurt their enemies on their behalf. After all, if a guy's willing to rape a woman, surely he can be counted on to visit destruction on Democrats, on woke individuals, on whoever. And with that as a backdrop, I'd love to invite our guests and panelists today, Kathie and Evan. Please turn on your videos and unmute yourself, and welcome to today's program.
Thanks for having us.
Well, it's just an absolute delight. And Kathie and Evan both, I would welcome you to just share a bit about yourselves and the work that you're doing. And then Evan, will turn it over to you for sharing some of the information.
Awesome. Well, welcome everybody to this really important conversation. We are honored to be able to be a part of it. My name is Kathie Moehlig. My pronouns are she, her. I am the founder and executive director of TransFamily Support Services. Important information to know is that I am also the parent of a trans person. My son started his transition well over a decade ago when he was just 11 years old. And back then, most people didn't even know what the word transgender meant, much less it affected younger kids. Where we live in San Diego, we had no doctors who were willing to treat him. Schools had no idea how to best support him. It was before we had all the laws that we have now that protect him. Insurance was in no way going to pay for his care. And so as I was advocating for his needs, more and more families were hearing the work I was doing and would reach out and ask me to help them with their kids. And I did that for a few years and then officially started the organization just a decade ago. And to date, we have served over 6,000 trans individuals and their families across the country. So we're a Southern California-based organization that works nationally, and we are here to serve trans individuals. Our tagline is navigation for the journey. So if it's something we can't help with, we know who can and can connect folks to the right people. Evan?
Thanks, Kathie. And yeah, my name is Evan. My pronouns are they, them. I am the training specialist with TransFamily Support Services. I've actually been working with the organization for just about almost 9 years now. I have been out as a transgender person since I was 15, and then I actually got to meet Kathie my senior year of high school, and she introduced me to this organization, and I got involved as a volunteer, and she can't get rid of me. So now my job is I get to bring this information and bring the experiences of my community to people who want to support us. I'm really privileged to be able to share from both my own perspective as a trans person, but also having gotten to work directly with our trans youth for so many years through this organization. I get to share what they're experiencing. Still knowing, what the youth of today are experiencing and not just having to rely on data or on my own experiences, which now are getting a little out of date. So yeah, I am really happy, Tom. If it's cool, I'll go ahead and share my screen, and we're going to talk through just some basic terminology because we understand that this conversation is not one that everyone is familiar with. A lot of the language that Kathie and I are really comfortable using is going to be completely new terms for some folks. So we want to level out the playing field. We're going to establish like some introductory language. It's not going to be super in-depth. So as terms pop up, we may still be defining them just to make sure we're clear in our communications, but it's a place to start. So I will go ahead and share my screen.
Yeah, thank you, Evan.
Of course, thanks. Okay. So as we are talking about supporting any sort of marginalized community, we have to identify this experience of culture and the depth of culture. And part of the depth of culture means that we as folks outside of that culture are never going to know the everything about it. So sociologists talk in terms of this idea of a cultural iceberg. And the cultural iceberg encourages us to recognize that from the outside perspective, we can only see about 10 to 20% of a cultural experience. And it is as we deliberately dive a little deeper that we start to see that fuller experience, that we start to see the full body of the iceberg under the surface of the water, right? So part of this conversation, Kathie and I are hoping to help bring you a little bit under the surface of the water, but there's tons of resources out there. There's tons of trans influencers and intersex influencers who you can follow, other organizations, to continue to grow your knowledge, especially since we are going to be talking about this conversation mostly within a US perspective. There's lots more to learn for the international community. It's also important we recognize the differences between the broader LGBTQ plus community and then the specific TG&I community. So when we're talking about LGBTQ plus, this is that big, beautiful acronym that lumps in things like sexual orientation, gender identities, all together. And that's wonderful and great, and we all find community with one another. There's a lot of intersectionality and overlap between non-straight identities and trans identities, but we know that there's also individual needs between these communities. So for the purposes of this conversation, we're going to specifically be talking about the TG&I community, and this stands for transgender, gender diverse, and intersex. So these are the needs of individuals that we would call non-cisgender. So we want to make sure that we're recognizing the distinction between these two communities, also the individuality that falls within these experiences. So I referenced this term cisgender earlier. We're going to define it within the context of what is gender identity. So zooming out, right? Gender identity is this idea, it exists within our brains around our own internal understandings of who we are. Everyone has a gender identity, and it can relate to social norms and values. It can relate to concepts around femininity and masculinity, but this is who we are. This is who we know ourselves to be. That is gender identity. It is truly based in our brains. We all have gender identity. We all also have a biological sex. And our biological sex, this is what's based in our anatomy and physiology. So this is where we would use language like male and female. That language is not necessarily as appropriate with gender identity. Gender identity is where we use language like man and woman. So gender identity, biological sex. It's also important we identify the distinction between biological sex and sex assigned at birth. Sex assigned at birth is just what was written on your first birth certificate based on the external presentation of your anatomy. But for a number of folks within the intersex community, their sex assigned at birth may not match their biological sex. So we're talking a little bit about within the cultural context of what's happening today when we see conversations around, limiting the expression or understanding of gender identity to just male and female. This is not only exclusionary of the trans community, but it's also deliberately erasing the existence of intersex individuals who biologically, anatomically are not male or female. And then everything else about a person, the way I look, the way I sound, the way I move, all of this is part of my gender presentation or my gender expression. And it's helpful to note that gender expression is not necessarily indicative of a person's gender identity. It really becomes clear the distinction between these two categories of self when we look cross-culturally. My partner is Indigenous. My partner's Purepecha. And in Purepecha culture, it is traditional that everyone keeps their hair in long braids. This symbolizes your connection to the world and the universe around you. So my partner has very long hair. In United States culture, we assume that long hair is something exclusive to people who identify as women. And so as my partner and I are navigating the world, a lot of people will look at them from the back and assume that they're a woman, and then they turn around and they have a mustache, and it's a little, it throws people because their gender expression is not what someone would assume in the US context. Gender expression is something that varies greatly depending on historical context and cultural context. So we know in being better globally minded people that we need to remove assumptions around gender identity based on expression. And that also becomes relevant for the trans population. Just because you see someone who wears makeup doesn't necessarily mean they identify as a woman. Just because you see someone with facial hair doesn't necessarily mean they identify as a man. So we're just expanding on some of these ideas. And then the last thing we're going to talk about, again, really broadly, there's a lot of terms up on this slide, and I'm not going to go over all of them because that would take so long. But I want to point out just a couple of ideas, right? So again, when we are talking about trans identities, this is a cultural experience. So there's lots of language that falls under this community. And I think it's easier for us to start with who's not transgender. And that's where we see language like cisgender, CIS gender. And this comes from the Latin meaning the same. A cisgender person is a person whose gender identity is the same as their sex assigned at birth. That's all that it means. We use cisgender as an adjective. It describes a person's identity. So someone is not a cisgender, someone is a cisgender man or a cisgender woman. Just like we use cisgender as an adjective, transgender is also an adjective. Someone is not a transgender, it's not transgenders, it is a transgender person. It's important that we use both of these terms equally because we are identifying equity in experiences. When we only use transgender to describe a certain subpopulation, what we're saying is that the default human experience is to not be transgender. We're saying that there's normal people, right? There's regular people, and then there's transgender people. And so in using terms like cisgender, we're leveling out that playing field. We're saying there are cis people, there are trans people, and these two things are equal. Helpful for us to have. Within the trans community, this just describes any person whose gender identity is then different than their sex assigned at birth. There's, of course, trans men, trans women, these binary identities, but there is also a whole slew of identities that fall outside of this binary. And we see these identities as non-binary or sometimes genderqueer. And lots of language that falls within that umbrella as well. We really like umbrella terms in these communities. It helps to like simplify the language. So there's a ton of different identities that fall within the non-binary community. I think it's also helpful for us to identify the fact that these identities have existed as long as civilization has existed. Within this non-binary umbrella, there's a ton of culturally specified identities. So identities like the Mahu, which is exclusive to Hawaiian communities, the Hijra, which is exclusive to India. And we see documentation of these trans and gender diverse identities all the way back to ancient Sumeria. So this is not anything new. We have seen trans individuals documented throughout history on every continent, from the brother boys and sister girls of Australia all the way up to the Sipanik of Inuit communities. Trans people aren't new, and trans people aren't geographically focused in any one country. So this is an important conversation for us to have, not just because of this very targeted population that we're seeing under this administration, but for all of us to know as trans folks are fighting for equality and equal treatment across the globe. That is my mini lecture. And then, yeah, Tom, I'll pass it back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Evan. I really appreciate it. And there was a request in the chat, folks wanting to know if they could access the slides. And so maybe it would be helpful if you could share where people can access the slides, or even put a link in the chat to where the slides can be accessed.
Yeah, can do.
Perfect. Thank you. So I'd like to pick up on that, that background and that information. It was really helpful for not only today's conversation and our viewers, but just in general for people to understand the history and the vocabulary and the identity and the distinctions. And I'll go from there to President Trump's executive order this week that's available on whitehouse.gov. where he has stated the position of his administration, that as of Monday afternoon, there are only male and female, and that there is no tolerance whatsoever for any deviation from his worldview. And I'll take it a step further to just say that in watching the talk given by the bishop of the National Cathedral here in Washington, D.C., she made an appeal for mercy directing it directly to President Trump. It's available on YouTube, and I would encourage all Americans to watch it. She was making an appeal for mercy for each of the targeted populations we're addressing this week. And President Trump rebuffed her appeal for mercy. And we'll get more into that later, but I'd love for the two of you just to speak to your interpretation of the executive order and your thoughts on the current administration with regard to the anybody who identifies anything other than male or female in our society.
Well, it comes as no surprise. This was an expected action. You know, when we go back to Trump's first administration, and he was very clear then how he felt about the trans and non-binary communities, putting a trans military ban in place by a tweet. You know, things like that. Project 2025 has been around. We know what could possibly be coming. Did we know what was coming on day one? No, but we had an idea. And so, you know, the idea of this mandate, it doesn't matter who says that there is only male and female. The reality is that people exist within identities that they exist within, whether somebody thinks they should or not. And so, you know, our fight has been long before Monday's executive order. And and I think it's important to recognize that the trans and non-binary community and their allies will be here long after this administration is not. And so, you know, we serve thousands of trans individuals and the people who love them. And it's important for us to stand on the shoulders of the generations of queer individuals that have been fighting this fight their whole lives, to have this piece of equality and recognition, right? It didn't just start a decade or two ago. That's just when there happened to be more visibility of trans identities. But this has been going on for quite some time. And so being able to stand in that place of, yes, it's going to be hard, and yes, rights are going to be stripped away, and we're going to carve out as much as we can. We're going to push and work and have legal fights over holding on to rights, holding on to health care, holding on to safe schools. And we're going to persevere in the end, because as a community, this fight is not just over the next 4 years. So that's my big general statement. Evan?
Yeah, I think there's also this piece, and someone put something similar in the chat of like, you know, these sorts of executive orders, these sorts of statements, they can be put out, but that doesn't change the fact that these identities exist. It doesn't change the fact that intersex people exist and will never fall within the binary of male or female. I always think it's interesting, you know, when we talk about the history of the United States, that the US Census used to only ever have two races. You were either white or you were Black. And we know that there have been more than just two races in the United States since before it was the United States. And it was only as government entities began recognizing the autonomy and the importance and significance of the Indigenous community, of the Latina community, of the Asian American community. So we see that the government always wants to establish who gets to say they're a part of this this thing that we call democracy, this thing that we call our civilization. And that doesn't change the fact that we're here anyways. And like Kathie said, we'll continue to be here. I get the privilege to be visible and to be out, but my ancestors and my elders have not had that privilege. And so if we need to do that again, we'll do it again, and we'll continue to do the fight.
Yeah, so speaking of that, I'd like to go down three different paths. One is the legal, the second is the cultural, and the third is the action. And so maybe if we start with the legal first, if you could just share with our audience what's happening on the legal front. We've seen a number of lawsuits happening at the state level and happening where people are fighting back, organizations are fighting back against some of the executive orders. And if you could just share with us what have you already seen and what are you involved with in trying to help protect legal rights?
Absolutely. So, you know, I guess the first piece is this point of our organizations, LGBTQ serving organizations and advocacy organizations, have come together and partnered in a way that I have not seen happen in the last 13 years I've been a part of this work. which has been great. And that was happening before the election and certainly increased after the election, because there is power when we're all coming in from one voice and all coming together to try and help prioritize when the battles are everywhere and you're spread across everything, right? We have to kind of prioritize. So I also we have a sister organization. I serve as the executive director of the Alliance for Trans Youth Rights. And it's a 501c4, so we can get a little bit more involved in the political part and those strategies. So it allows a voice at a table that, in particular, parents of trans youth haven't always had a voice at. So that's a helpful piece. Legally, we know already that attorney generals across the country, many different states, have come together and are already in lawsuits against a lot of executive orders, not just the one around gender identity, but immigration and several other things. I live in California. Some people talk about we live in a bubble. Yes, to some extent, we live in a bubble. I work with people across the country. And I know that our governor really did prioritize immediately after the election a budget appropriations to give more money to the attorney general to fight these executive orders, to fight what we knew was coming, and has prioritized, looking at our LGBTQ folks, our immigrants that we have in California, as have many, many other states. So there is a fight. Executive orders can be fought in court. Executive orders aren't the same as laws being passed. This on a practical level, what we know is going to happen is that that things like having access to changing gender markers on passports and federal documentation is there. There is a real concern that folks who have been able to access the X gender marker on their passport, folks that are in that non-binary sort of umbrella that Evan talked about, may have chosen to do that in the past because it was available, and that the possibility of, if you're doing international travel, when you come back into our country, that they may confiscate your passport, and that might become really problematic. So we knew this was coming. We did tell people it might be good to change your X gender marker on your passports to save that piece. So there are practicalities of that. There is, as Evan stated already, this piece around the community that if we have to take a step back for safety, we take a step back for safety. It is a pause to progress, not a stop to progress.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think it would be helpful for the audience just to understand the legacy of the legislation, whether it's access to healthcare, access to ability to marry, just the road that has already been traveled over the last several decades for what is at issue right now.
Yeah, so I can give a little bit of a window into that, and then Evan can add to it. When my son started his transition 13 years ago, we didn't have doctors who were treating much of the trans population at all, but in particular, there were very few doctors in the country that were treating youth, minors. And as I stated, insurance wasn't covering any gender affirming care. So it was the Affordable Care Act that sort of changed the trajectory when we talk about healthcare in that Section 1557 and the discrimination against trans population accessing medically necessary care. So what happened as a result of the Affordable Care Act is individuals were now able to access this care that only the privileged few had access to previously that could pay cash. And then it also had a demand of, more physicians, more providers joining in providing this care and getting educated around this community. And when we think about like, okay, so a new provider is going to start serving this community, it's not just the provider that's getting educated, it's all the people in their offices, in their realm getting educated. You know, that has a ripple effect to our greater population and community. And so we've seen that ripple effect. And as I said in my introduction, when I used to, you know, when my son first started this journey, having to really define what it meant, I don't have to do that anymore. Some of it is because of the progress that has been made, and some of it is because of the hate that has started. You know, North Carolina's HB1 bill, that was the first bathroom bill that we saw, really brought the conversation to the average kitchen table. That's a benefit that we are still riding on, even though the law ended up not passing. So, Evan, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, I mean, just talking the legacy of trans identities and the legacy of trans dissent against oppressive laws and oppressive governments. I mean, we can talk all the way back to the colonization of Native peoples in the United States, right? And there's a legacy of like anti-cross-dressing laws, which have always impacted and targeted trans individuals. We can talk about how during the raiding of gay bars in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and how that impacted trans individuals who we were finding safety and community in those spaces because we had nowhere else to go, and how the crackdown on these institutions then caused our community to have to isolate. But I mean, I think a lot of folks in the United States now know, partially because Kathie mentioned, we've had a huge flux in visibility for our community. You know, these same oppressive laws have also created what trans joy and trans resiliency has looked like. One of the two of the most notable moments have really come out of state violence, of law enforcement violence against LGBTQ individuals. We talk about like the Compton riots in the Bay Area. We talk about the Stonewall riots in New York, and how these two moments kind of founded the modern Pride movement. So this history of anti-trans legislation and anti-trans law, both at the federal and at the state level, have also then created what we today get to celebrate. And I think a lot of people take for granted things like Pride celebrations, and not always knowing the legacy that this came from things like these oppressive laws. As we're seeing, you know, conversations like HB, I think it was HB2, HB1 or 2. Yeah, HB2 with North Carolina. Now we're seeing on the federal level with Congresswoman Sarah McBride, of this piece of trying to attempt to ban trans folks from accessing public restrooms or accessing restrooms on federal property. These sorts of strict denials of our existence are largely what create the opportunity for our blooming of our ability to thrive. Once we have that visibility, our community has shown time and time again how tenacious we are, and our ability to take opportunity in these oppressive regimes, and to turn it into something where now we are going to not only put forward progress for ourselves as trans folks, but often in moving the needle to create equity for trans individuals, we are creating a more inclusive and equitable world for the broader LGBTQ community, for women and other marginalized genders. We are just moving forward as hard as we can. So this is nothing new. The federal level is nothing new, and it's a little unnerving right now, but I think we're all finding our balance again.
Yeah, as we transition to the cultural topic, I'd like to, if you're both comfortable, just talk about the journey itself. possibly changing one's name, changing pronouns, changing government documents, passports, mental and psychological support, medical support, etc. Just if you wouldn't mind just sharing the journey itself as
Yeah.
someone is.
I'll be happy to start. I saw someone in the chat asking about some of my experience as the mom of a trans kid. So, but I'm going to talk a little bit broadly too. Just Tom, if you think about all those things you just named, every single one of those is a barrier and a roadblock to just the existence, right? So, certainly when my son started this journey and trying to find a doctor and calling our local children's hospital and saying, my kid's trans, he needs to see a doctor, and they're like, oh, we don't treat kids like that here. And I was like, you just said that to the wrong damn mama. Like, that's not okay. Right. And then looking at, when we talk about in terms of like gender affirming care, when people hear that term, oftentimes they think about medical care and maybe surgery, because we're conditioned in our society to think that way. But gender affirming care for any individual can be things like the correct name and pronoun being used amongst influential people in their lives, family, close friends. It could mean things like haircuts or getting access to clothing. For our young kids, oftentimes it's, redecorating a room to be more in line with who they really are. And then it can step into having your rights at school for our kids, being seen for who you are, being able to use that name and pronoun, which, many of our states allow, but almost 30 of our states do not allow, and may even have legislation against kids being able to use the name that they identify with. And then, moving to that is this mental health piece. And, we just saw Meta, who now is allowing people to talk about trans people in ways of that it's a mental illness, right? And that is extremely distressing and extremely hurtful and harmful to this community. Is there places for mental health individuals, providers to serve the community? Absolutely, just like every other community, right? We all have things. When you are part of a community that is so attacked and so pervasively in front of the public in the way that this campaign, this presidential campaign, which, by the way, they spent over $200 million on anti-trans ads across the country, right? If you're part of a community that's attacked like that, of course you're going to have anxiety and depression issues. Of course you're going to need some professionals to help you in dealing with what the reality is. So gender affirming care, including that mental health piece, and then also including the medical piece, which not every person accesses medical care as part of their gender affirming care. And there certainly isn't like a checklist. Oh, you're trans. Here you go. Here's what you're going to do. And I also, just because there is so much misinformation, I always want to make sure that I put out that no children are accessing medical care. Medical care for adolescents does not start until the start of puberty. Nobody gets this access without parental consent. That is just, doctors would lose their license. So that's not happening either. And I do think that as we move forward, this educational piece, even just that few minutes that Evan took at the beginning, I'll put in some real information, is going to make a difference.
Yeah, it's funny. So, Tom, you referenced this laundry list of spaces where trans folks have had to kind of claw our way into recognition, and Kathie mentioned the barriers. And I think a lot of these things are aspects of like my life as a trans person that cisgender individuals kind of take for granted. I've been, like I said in my introduction, I've been out in different contexts since I was 15 years old, but I wasn't out to my parents until I was in my 20s. And that's not for lack of trying. Actually, my parents were some of the first people that I attempted to tell I was trans, and they just weren't ready. They didn't have um, the background or the knowledge to be able to support me or even to understand what I was trying to tell them. So even just that piece of I had to educate my parents in the context of the work I was doing before they could understand it in the context of me, their own child. Um, but things like I don't have a single piece of legal documentation that reflects who I am. I don't have a single piece of legal documentation with my name or my gender marker because I don't feel safe to do that. California has had the opportunity for an X gender marker, for this non-binary gender marker, for years now, and I have never accessed it. The one time I thought about it was in 2020, and now with the way that things have changed politically, it's just not feasible for me. And I don't feel like it's something I'll ever be able to do in my lifetime. Another big thing, that has always come up for me, specifically being non-binary and someone who presents myself in a way that is contradictory to accessing certain spaces, is I've never been able to like comfortably say that I have restroom access. I never know when I'm going to a space if I'm going to have access to a safe restroom for me to use the restroom. When I was in college, I started recording how long it took for me to walk to the nearest all-gender restroom, and my longest walk from one of my lectures was 10 minutes one way. So that's a lot of lecture that I was then missing out on. And oftentimes these are single stall restrooms. So like, God forbid someone be in the restroom and then I have to wait even longer. And so it's just like little things within my daily life that I just know. I know that if I'm out at a restaurant, I need to be super mindful of how much water I'm drinking because I'm not going to be able to go to the bathroom until I get home. I figured out when I was in middle school and high school that if I didn't eat or I didn't drink any water and I didn't do breakfast, then I would make it until I got home at the end of the day before I needed to use the restroom. I have only had one doctor in my life who was willing to attempt to refer to me correctly, and even then he still never really got it. So there's just there's so much of my life that I am constantly aware of, that cisgender folks who don't have any connections to a trans person, and even our allies who do listen to us, I mean, you will just never know all of these parts of my life that I'm constantly thinking about. And this isn't obviously exclusive to the trans community. If you are within a marginalized community, chances are you have things like this that you're constantly thinking about. So I think it's just helpful to know, like, here's just some of ours. Here are some of the things that I am constantly thinking about just in order to exist in the world outside of my home. But that's not to say being trans is like a miserable existence. I don't want to make that the message of this conversation. Like, I genuinely can say that I love being trans. And I wouldn't change who I am. And there's so much joy that comes from my community and the resiliency that we've been talking about, though I don't love that we have to be resilient. But I wouldn't change this. And it's not being transgender that makes my life challenging. It is the world's deep hate of transgender people that makes my life hard.
Yeah, and picking up on that, earlier in the week, I referenced Father Greg Boyle's recent book called Cherished Belonging. And in the book, in chapter 2, he addresses the cruelty that many of our political leaders are openly exhibiting in their words, in their actions, in their deeds. And he talks about behind that cruelty are people who aren't well. The leaders themselves aren't well. And we as a society don't want to talk about that piece of it. And yet anybody who is being othered is the recipient of that cruelty. And I'd like to just talk a bit about, you know, the culture that we're living in, the cruelty that we're seeing from our newly elected president and those around him, and your thoughts on the cruelty and how do we support each other, and how do we help each other during these next 4 years?
Evan, I'm going to let you address that first, and then I'll go.
Very stunning. So I come from a social work background, right? So that kind of always colors my views and my experiences of how to be a better human, right? And I think one of the biggest pieces that we're seeing that seems to no longer be the default is human empathy. And I think as long as we're leaning into this piece of empathy, then we're going to be guided in the right direction. Mistakes are going to happen, right? We are always going to make mistakes as we're trying to create safety and solidarity and to survive in harsh environments. That those mistakes just can't be what you get stuck in. So one of the biggest things that we talk about when it comes to supporting marginalized folks is to just lead from that piece of empathy. There are so many small steps you can take, so many small ways you can establish yourself as an ally to our community. Listening on this conversation, being a part of this conversation is a huge start. Continuing to learn more about your local community, your local resources is the next step. But things like, you know, introducing yourself with your pronouns is something small that you can start with. Having your pronouns anywhere you have your name. It's not disclosing any personal information for most people to have your pronouns out. I will say the asterisk to most people is those of us who use pronouns outside of the typical binary. For myself as a non-binary person, as soon as I introduce myself with my pronouns, as soon as I tell someone that my pronouns are they, them, I'm outing myself. So I'm innately unsafe by doing that. You can make me safer if you are the first person to introduce yourself with your pronouns. Then I know I can do the same. Otherwise, I'm just not going to say anything. So little things, you know, if you are introducing yourself to someone for the first time, you want them to say your name correctly, so you say your name first. You want them to address you correctly, you say your pronouns. It's just language. We all use these pronouns. So that's a big piece. Yeah, I think that's kind of the greatest place to start too. I think that leads a lot of conversations. You're going to have a lot more interesting interactions with the humans around you once you start with that step, both folks like myself who will be grateful that you've done that, even if we never tell you, and folks who may have questions. Kathie talks about when she started introducing herself with her pronouns, especially to other parents, and how that sometimes then sparked conversation of like, why are you doing this? And what does that mean? So I think that's a helpful place for us to start. Kathie.
I think when we look at, you know, what's coming from this administration, first of all, I'm an old schooler. I go back to Mr. Rogers, who says, look for the helpers, right? And so while there is a lot of rhetoric, recognizing that it's rhetoric, recognizing that it's based in misinformation and lies, not in facts, I think is helpful. And shutting it off. Like we have this obsession with what crazy thing is going to happen today, right? From this administration. Who cares? What difference does it make? It doesn't make a difference to our fight. Our fight is our fight. If you're an ally, you're going to stand up for the trans people around you, regardless of who it is that's talking what. So I think that's one of it. I also think that one of the biggest pieces that we can all be involved in, regardless of who we are and where we are in the country, in the world, is to get educated, right? I mean, Evan did a beautiful job in just a couple of minutes of bringing a lot of new information, probably to some folks who are listening to this, maybe a reminder to other folks that maybe have heard some of this, but recognizing that just because something is said doesn't make it true. Right. I want to address one of the biggest misconceptions that we have been dealing with for years is that there are more trans people now than there ever have been. And that is not true. What is true is there has been progress made in the rights of trans people, so they are far more visible than what they ever have been in history. But if you take a moment to look at queer history, you will see this piece. I mean, Evan talked about, laws. And again, I'm in San Diego. Up until 1976 or 74, we had laws in San Diego that you could be arrested, and many were arrested for wearing a garment that belonged to the opposite sex. There is only one reason there would be a law like that on the books, and that's because there were trans people trying to be out and visible trans people. So this is not something that's new. This is not something that is just like, the social contagion of our youth. It's an interesting thing. I had a call the other day, and I shared with some members of my staff that, a parent said, oh, and my kid is questioning their gender identity. And it's like, typically the only people that question their gender identity are in fact trans or non-binary people. And as someone who sits in the privilege of being cisgender, I've never questioned my gender identity. Right. And so I think that education is so vitally important. If you hear something, track down where it came from. Be the type of person that's sharing information that you can trust, and that you've even gone back to the community of which it's about. Like, I wouldn't say things about the immigrant community until I checked with the people in the immigrant community that it's correct. So why aren't we doing that when it comes to trans identities as well?
Yeah, thank you. So I'd like to transition now to the conversation about action, and what can our audience do to support the trans community, to support any of the marginalized communities that are under attack from the administration. And love to just spend a few minutes just talking about what our audience can do.
Do you want to start?
Right, I'm
Yeah.
typing in chat of how someone can introduce yourself with your pronouns. Someone else got it, but just for folks who are watching, someone asked in the chat, how do I actually use this piece of introducing myself with my pronouns?
So let's practice it. Let's take a minute, right? So if I'm in a meeting, and I try to go first because I am a cisgender person, and I do want to be able to allow anyone else that's in the room, whether it's in person or over Zoom, to know that it's okay. So I will say, hello, my name is Kathie. My pronouns are she, her. And just that one piece. Other people may not pick up on it. Other people are going to, like Evan said, I've had so many people that are like, I don't understand why you're saying this. For a long time, I would just say, my name is Kathie, she, her, and then move on until I was in a meeting and somebody thought my last name was she, her. And so I'm like, okay, I have to say it's my pronouns in order for people to have an understanding. And then, as we go around the room, Tom, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Tom. My pronouns are he, him.
And Evan.
And I'm Evan, and my pronouns are they, them. And it's just like that. And there's going to be stumbling blocks. My favorite thing is when I'm in a meeting and I hear someone say oh, I'm Stacy and my pronouns are he, him. And it's like, yes, Stacy, you tell me what your pronouns are. I love this for you. But the helpful thing is we're starting and we're trying, and eventually the language becomes really comfortable. I think the other thing I want to call out is, we're doing this every time we introduce ourselves, not just when we think there's a trans person in the room or when we know there's a trans person, because You've met a trans person before, and you just may never know. We could be anywhere. Just like folks like Kathie, parents of trans folks, could be anywhere. So making sure this is a step we're taking all the time. I think email signatures, business cards, anywhere you have your name is an opportunity to also bring this visibility and have your pronouns.
I think that's a really important point is, we want to make sure that we get people's names correct, right? We also need to make sure that we're getting their pronouns correct. And I'm not going to walk in a room and look across the room and go, oh, that person's name must be Dave, right? When his name is Tom. And so we shouldn't be doing that with pronouns.
So there's a question in the chat, and I think it speaks to taking action. So the question is, the stories of detransitioners get weaponized and blown out of proportion. Are there any reliable stats? What percentage of folks actually regret their transition? And for me, it's a bigger question. It's a question, and we saw it in the 1980s. The Reagan administration put a team of people together, and they spent about 18 months trying to find a quote unquote welfare queen that they could hold up as an example. And it took them quite some time to find a woman in Wisconsin that fit their profile of a welfare queen. And all of a sudden that became the policy of the Reagan administration. And we're seeing the same thing with the trans community and the Trump administration, the weaponizing of misinformation. And so I'd like to address that question, but more broadly, I'd like to talk about, in this conversation around what action can we take? How do we help educate, inform, and what actions can we take to deal with this misinformation that's out there?
Well, there's a couple of things. The stories of detransitioners is far beyond just the Trump campaign. We've been dealing with years of state legislators trying to legislate out trans individuals and the existence. And they've used detransitioners as that place. So right now we have 26 states that have banned gender affirming care for minors. And a big part of that is these detransitioners who they have gotten a hold of a couple of people and they travel around the country and they get paid a lot of money to share their story. Detransitioning is a real thing for some people. Absolutely. This is a journey, and some people's journey takes them on places with twists and turns and U-turns sometimes. And we shouldn't devalue somebody's existence because we think they shouldn't be detransitioning, right? The individuals that are on that journey deserve the same rights to all the care, medical, mental health support, family support as anybody else. But in direct relation to the question, detransitioners, we know from multiple different studies, and you can look at the US Trans Survey, you can look at the Williams Institute has research on this, that detransitioners are less than 3% of the overall trans population. So there's a lot of different statistics around there, depending on which one you pick. The CDC says that it's like 1.5% of the population identifies as trans, but then when we break it down to high schoolers, it could be as high as 9%. Like it's all over the place. But it is a very small number in comparison to the amount of rhetoric and money that is being spent to squash the entire population. So, the calls to action, I think, when it comes to the narratives around detransitioners is that, yes, this can happen, but we cannot deny somebody's existence because the possibility of they may identify differently in the future. They may discover more about themselves. We've worked with thousands of trans people. Have I had some people detransition? Absolutely. Have we wrapped around them and their families? For sure. And what I can tell you is that in particular, our minors our young adults have all told me, if my family hadn't supported me in who I was in the beginning, I couldn't get to where I am today and the confidence in who I am now. And so I think it's really important that we understand that it is a gender journey that individuals go on, and it's not a destination, and we can't withhold any kind of affirmation or gender affirming care based on the fact that maybe somewhere down the road this might change.
And,
Evan?
and just, yeah, another piece to that, like Kathie mentioned, right? It's less than 3% of the trans population who have accessed medical transition who then detransition. Of that less than 3%, it is a fraction of those individuals who regret their medical transition. When we look at regret rates, people are more likely to regret getting a Harry Potter tattoo than they are to regret having access to gender affirming care. They're more likely to regret something like an injury repair, a knee replacement is one of the statistics that we've looked up, than they are to access gender affirming care. So it's unfortunate because this rhetoric around the weaponization of detransitioning and detrans individuals has then turned into folks who I know personally who have been on this journey of, I don't think medical transition is right for me anymore, but if I stop, am I then another chess piece for the far right to use to hurt my community and to hurt the people that I love? And it's unfortunate because that means that this rhetoric, this narrative of a percentage of a percentage of a percentage of a population has meant that some folks are now compromising their own journey because they are afraid of that journey being used to harm other people. Yeah, I have a lot of people in my life who have questioned their journey as they have accessed medical transition. It's super typical within the non-binary community that at some point in our transition, we stop and we ask ourselves, am I doing the right thing? Am I doing, what's authentic to who I am? And sometimes maybe that's the reality, is that it's not anymore right for who you are. That doesn't change the fact that for a time it was right. And there are so many barriers to accessing medical transition that there's a lot of time for us to think about it as we are on the journey. So it's unfortunate that this community is being so weaponized. And for folks who are listening who know someone who's detransitioning, or if you're questioning or you are detransitioning, like, we're still here for you too. This community is still here for you as well. And just because this identity wasn't right for you anymore doesn't mean that we're not holding it against you, and these resources and these services are still applicable to you. And we're still here. We're still here to be a resource.
I want to also just highlight real quickly, Tom, I'm sorry. There are many people who may detransition for the fact of they lose their careers, they may lose their families. Like, we have to look at that the barriers to people being affirmed for who they are so pervasive and so real that alone, I know people who have done it because they thought they were going to lose their families if they continued down their journey. And this is also why we're seeing, our oldest client is 88. This person didn't just come to this understanding about themselves at this age. They've known for decades and decades. They've come to a place where they felt safe enough in their life to be able to claim who they are now.
Well, thank you both. I'm going to invite Jim back into the conversation as we bring the show to a close. Welcome back, Jim.
What an inspiration you both are. You radiate transformational leadership. So I just want to thank you and acknowledge that. I think everyone who's listening to this program knows the deep authenticity with which you're approaching these challenges, both personally and professionally. So I just want to thank you. I think the question that is of most concern to, I would say, people out there that may want to be more tolerant than they are, is the issue of whether children should be supported in engaging in a transformation, particularly with, chemical therapies and potential operations and so forth and so on, before they've reached the age of accountability. My conversations with people is less that they are opposed to it, but they're opposed to allowing, particularly with taxpayers' money, a procedure which is irrevocable and on the part of people who aren't even allowed to vote or to buy alcohol or engage in any adult activity. So I would love to just hear both of your comments on this issue, because it feels to me to have triggered far more resistance than would have naturally happened had children been protected.
So I have a couple of comments. The rhetoric is around parental rights. If my child had diabetes, I would do everything in my power to get my child the care that they needed for those diabetes treatment, so that my child could be well and thrive. When someone is experiencing gender dysphoria, it is a medical diagnosis, is a mental health diagnosis. It has a medical treatment. There is something to be done. Somebody had asked for some more reference to my son's experience. And I'll just say, back when we didn't know what we know now, he suffered for years because nobody would listen to the fact that I thought there was a gender issue happening for him. I almost lost him because professionals were uneducated and kept coming up with other reasons for why he was suffering so much. So this piece around, should minors have access to medically necessary care according to the AMA? Yes. Do they do that without a mental health provider? Do they do that without a medical provider? Do they do that without parental consent and education? Absolutely not. This idea that, a child can get access to this care is kind of ludicrous. And also the idea that there is a progression of what this care happens. Children are not accessing surgeries. Adolescents are not accessing surgeries outside of a few exceptions. There is recent information that we have from a study, and I can get the source, it's not coming to my brain right now, that across the country, less than 3,000 adolescents are currently getting either blockers or cross-sex hormones. So I would also respectfully, Jim, it is not chemical, it is medical. These are hormones that have been used across generations for various different reasons. And so I think we have to be very careful of our language to not escalate what is already so problematic. So I'm going to stop because I know Evan has some things that they would like to share.
Yeah, I think the narrative has been really cleverly put from individuals who want to cause harm to our community. But like Kathie said, this is something that's happening, first of all, in alignment with a person's puberty. So medical professionals are looking for a child to have reached what's called Tanner stage 2, in their pubescent development before they even start something like Kathie mentioned of hormone blockers, which is like a pause button on a person's natural natal puberty. And that's before they're able to access something like gender affirming hormones, something like artificial testosterone or estrogen. So it's a long process. We referenced that there are so many barriers. I mean, for some of us, we have to attend like multiple appointments with an insurance designated mental health professional before we get a letter of recommendation. And then we have to like make sure we're sure. And there used to be laws or like medical guidance that we had to live as our identified gender for X amount of time before we were considered for gender affirming surgeries, which then like, how does a trans woman safely live as a woman if she has an Adam's apple and she's not on estrogen, right? So it's a very cleverly put rhetoric that is just not true and it's not applicable. And we know from the detransitioning community that these procedures and these treatments are not irreversible, right? If a person transitioned one time, they can transition again with a few exceptions. So it's just not applicable. It's just not the reality of our community, and it's not helpful for us to talk about. And someone mentioned in the chat, you know, this reference to historical reassignment surgeries at birth. This was happening to intersex infants. This was not happening to designate someone as transgender at birth. This was when people who were intersex, who anatomically their external genitals didn't match what was considered appropriate for a penis or for a vulva and a clitoris, that individual then may have been non-consensually treated for their intersex variation in order to appear endosex, in order to appear anatomically male or female. Those children may have been forced onto hormones. Those children may have been forced to obtain certain surgeries and medical procedures at an inappropriate age against their consent and maybe without their parents' knowledge, because of this insistence we have as a society on this rigid system of a gender and a sex binary that just isn't real. So I think like ultimately it is this piece of, yes, non-consensual medical treatments and non-consensual medical procedures are happening. It's not trans people, that's happening to intersex people. And there's a long history of advocacy coming from the intersex community. I encourage you to check out organizations like Interact in order to learn more about that part of the conversation, because intersex is another layer that Kathie and I don't hold that experience. But for us as trans people, we have to fight tooth and nail in order to access medical transition. And it is something that is so closely gatekept by institutions that it's just not helpful for us to talk about who should be and who shouldn't be allowed to make the decisions outside of the person who is experiencing the dysphoria, potentially their parent if they are a minor, and their medical team. And that's really where this conversation should stay closed about accessing medical care.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you. I think that is a question around which there's a lot of emotion, and I think you both have answered it very well. And I'd just like to take up, Evan, your the second to the last point. You know, if we just would stop projecting gender onto our children, and like many indigenous societies and Asian societies, even in ancient Greece and Rome, there was much more of a notion of sex and gender being in a fluid relationship, shall we say. And if the society from birth is tolerant, then many of the problems that you're identifying would never appear. It's actually the intolerance of the system that is causing a major part of the problems that we're witnessing. Yeah, so I mean, it's really, thank you so much for this. It's really been important. And if I could ask just one final question, I'm intrigued at the the statistics, because given the enormity of the issue, the actual statistics that you're citing of 3,000 people going through the process in the United States is awfully small. That it seems as if there's a disproportion between the people actually having the experience and needing the support and the spin in the culture that there's a systemic attack on little boys and little girls that's being orchestrated by sort of the deep state.
Absolutely.
And we need to be really afraid. So as we close, I'd love to have you just comment on the distinction between the reality and because Trump is responding to a projection in his mind that actually has very little to do with reality itself.
Yeah, and I think so. There's a couple of things. The rhetoric is so huge, and like you said, it has painted this picture that, like, they're coming for your kids. They're coming. I have been called a groomer. There's a whole plethora of people who believe that I'm out recruiting kids to become transgender, right? That is certainly not the case. So if we look at, and again, I cannot remember where the information is, but I can find it, that there are less than 3,000 or about 3,000 adolescents who are getting either hormone blockers or cross-sex hormones at clinics across the country right now, right? We also have to remember that 26 states are not allowing for this care. And so access to the care has become excruciatingly difficult for people who need the care. But it's a small number. Even just last week, Congress had called in the head of the NCAA to talk about the whole trans women in sports that is now a bill that the House has passed. It's moved to the Senate. And they asked, there are over 500,000 athletes within the jurisdiction of the NCAA. And then they asked, how many are trans? Less than 10. And yet Congress is spending all of this time in testifying and in pushing this bill that affects such a small amount of people. But we're not talking about school shootings. We're not talking about healthcare access. We're not talking about the price of groceries and gas at the level that we're talking about trans identities. Why is that? Because it's the political pawn and power.
Exactly. It's a wedge issue. It's a wedge issue. By the way, Kathie, just a question. Assuming the 26 states didn't have any restrictions, what would be the number? We know that there's 3,000 now, but if there were no restrictions and it was developing naturally, would you say there would be 6,000 people, 10,000? Do you have any? But I'm trying to get at, it would still be small. If we weren't making it an issue, it would still be almost a minuscule issue when you consider 350 million people in the United States.
Yes. Yes.
Got it. Great. Thank you. Thank you. Do you have any comment, Evan? And then Tom will wrap us up.
I have Kathie, I have the study with the 300,000 trans youth in the country, and of that, I think it's like 1.4% who are accessing medical care. It comes from the Center for American Progress, and I can put the link in chat for folks. And there's a ton of phenomenal statistics.
Let me pause there, make sure we all understand. You're saying there's 300,000 individuals in the United States that are somehow identify or included in this trans category.
300,000 specifically trans youth within the 13 to 17 age range. So it's 1.4% of 13 to 17-year-olds who are identifying as transgender according to this statistic.
Yeah. that's
I
important.
need to
everyone,
interrupt.
because-
I am so sorry. There is a fire. I need to go take care of some things. This is part of living in
Go for it.
Southern
Go for
California.
it.
So Evan is not in San Diego and not close to the fire, so they can stay on and they can do your after chat. I apologize, but I have to go take care of this. Thank
Okay,
you
go
for
for
having
it.
me on.
Thank you, Kathie.
Well, we can just, I think we've come to the final point, and thank you, Evan, that
Yeah,
we're
great.
dealing with 1.4% of the US kind of youth population. And of that, a fraction, 1.4% of the 1.4% are actually engaging in really any kind of therapeutic process. So I think that's a nice point with which to end, Tom, because we're seeing the weaponization of an issue that actually doesn't really exist. If it was held in just normal ways, particularly given mass shootings that are happening at the level of 2 a day, and drug addictions and self-harm and mental illnesses that are rampant through the culture. So we need to understand, everyone, this is a weapon, this is an issue that was weaponized for electoral purposes and to feed a base. It has very little to do with reality. So anyway, that's the point I wanted to bring in, Tom and Evan. So thank you both. Tom, why don't you make any closing remarks and tee us up for tomorrow?
Yeah, Jim, I'll just build off your point. It's not just a distraction and a weaponization, but it's a distraction from what else is going on. And it's easy to keep the media and keep the attention on a non-issue than the real issues at hand. And that's being done intentionally, it's being done on purpose. And to some of my comments earlier, it's being done in a way that is just absolutely cruel and ruthless and inhumane to the the various populations and people being affected. And I have a really difficult time with that. Evan, big thank you for being with us today. And please thank Kathie again for her attendance. Tomorrow we're going to shift our focus to the next population that's been targeted, and we're going to focus tomorrow on women's sovereignty. The president has made it abundantly clear that it's his intention to control women, and so we'll have another robust conversation tomorrow on this week on strategic resistance. So thank you, Jim. Thank you, Evan. And thank you all for being with us today.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Evan. And that'll bring us to a close, everyone. You can join Evan and Tom in the after chat. The link has just been put up by Stan in the chat box, and you received a link to the after chat in your Zoom reminders for today. And tomorrow we'll have our 4th out of 5 sessions on strategies for resistance. Thank you, everyone.